The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. I'm Steve Dunn. To find out more about the Charlotte Ledger, visit thecharlotteledger.com. I'm joined today by Raj Merchant, Director in Data and Analytics at Perficient, a global IT consulting company, and volunteer about town, known as Board Chair of Feeding Charlotte. Welcome, Raj.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. I'd like to ask you about a light bulb moment that you had when you're enrolled in the executive MBA program at UNC Chapel Hill, and you are going back and forth between Charlotte and the Triangle, spending a lot of time in the car. And you had a profound experience in connection with entrepreneurship and the revelation that early stage nonprofits are a lot like startups in a way. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steve. So I was taking some entrepreneurship classes at Chapel Hill in the MBA program, and we were learning a lot about social enterprise as well. And that was something that was really interesting to me, learning about the parallels between an early stage startup and an early stage nonprofit. And an early stage nonprofit has a lot of the same challenges, right? You might have a solo founder who is trying to, might be not taking a salary, might be the only employee, might be really trying to figure out how do you scale, how do you grow, how and when do you hire people, how do you raise money, right? Much different mission, but the same challenges. And so that just resonated with me. And I thought that it would be really interesting to sort of see how I could get involved and support early stage nonprofits here in Charlotte. And it was around the same time that I was starting to sort of see what opportunities might exist here in Charlotte to get more involved in nonprofits in that way. And through some people that I knew in town, got connected with a nonprofit called Social Venture Partners Charlotte, and really learning about them sort of gave me that. I found that avenue to be able to get involved with nonprofits in that way.
Well, a early stage nonprofit is similar to and on a parallel track with a startup business venture in a lot of ways, but then there are some pretty significant ways in which they're different too, right? So, right. And it just, as somebody who isn't deeply knowledgeable about the space, it seems as though in a business venture, some of the objectives are very clearly understood by everyone and they're very easy to measure. So on some level, it's about achieving some kind of a product market fit and making money. And how much money you're making is an easy way of evaluating how your organization is performing. Yeah. It's something that the investors or the stakeholders can easily wrap their hands around. And even you yourself as a founder can know that whether you're on the right track or not. And then meanwhile, in an early stage nonprofit, it seems to me as though it might be harder to know how we're doing, with your objective being to deliver on some kind of a mission, right? So how do you think about that in terms of not just the similarities, but also the differences?
Well, and I think I'm glad that you used the term product market fit, because that's very much a for-profit startup term, but I think that's very true for nonprofits as well, right? Because if you're launching a program, right, you need to know, is there a need for it? Is there demand for it? Is it going to fit within your local community? And so, for example, one of the nonprofits that I spent a lot of time with is Feeding Charlotte. And so, for them, there was clearly a need in Charlotte around food going to waste and neighbors in need of food. And was there anyone else in the community, sort of fulfilling the mission in that way? No, there was a gap, right? So I think it's the same approach where you need a product market fit. You also, by the way, need to be financially sound and sustainable. So one thing that a lot of nonprofits are, tasked to do is to have a certain amount of money in operating reserves, right? Do you have enough runway, right? If you talk about with startups, you talk about how much runway you have in terms of capital versus your expenses. And so you have the same thing with nonprofits where you need to be raising money, but you also need to have enough reserves so that you are sustainable, so that if something does happen, if you lose a major funder or if you don't get a grant that you expected, that you still have 6 to 9 months of of reserves in the bank so that you can continue serving your mission. So honestly, what's interesting is that I think that nonprofit founders kind of have those same challenges and more, because then it's also, are you staying true to your mission? How do you assess the outcome or the efficacy of the program that you're launching? And then I think there's this entire sort of perception with donors where it's like, how are you spending that money, right? A lot of people, there's something I've been learning about over the last couple of years called trust-based philanthropy, which is the idea that you should trust nonprofits to use your funding in unrestricted funding, because a lot of people say, I want my dollars to go towards the people that you serve. I don't want it to go towards overhead. But the idea
it's a whole thing. Yeah,
it's a whole thing, right?
Let's talk about this, because this is in the nonprofit world, the unrestricted funds are the best. That's definitely what you want. Like we need money that we can use for whatever we, in our judgment, think we need to use it for. But you're right. There's a lot of donors out there who want their funds to be directed toward program-specific things, or maybe even particular constituencies within the communities that you serve as a nonprofit. And that's fine. We like money. Well, restricted money is better than no money.
It is.
It usually is. But there's a couple of things that can happen. For one thing that can be a negative is if you find yourself chasing restricted funds that then sort of impacts your mission or distracts you from your mission, or shifts the course of your company. And then the other thing, of course, is that sometimes bona fide needs go unmet while other needs are sort of overmet, right? And so what does that look like in the fundraising world? When you talk about trust-based initiatives, is it basically just like an impulse toward unrestricted funds?
I mean, I think that's the idea, right? Is that you really want to be able to show that you have those outcomes, right? And to say, okay, we're delivering on our mission, we're, serving. I think one of the challenges we have with that I've seen with Feeding Charlotte is that, there's a metric that we kind of measure around the cost per meal that we rescue, right? Because we're basically rescuing X amount of pounds of food and then delivering that. And so for us, if that's a key metric, we need to then be able to rescue more food to be able to get that dollar per, like our expenses are kind of staying flat. And so we need to be able to rescue more food without adding more people to staff, right? It's just sort of, how do you define your KPIs and your metrics to be able to message that you're doing things efficiently,
to give people trust.
Yeah, to give people trust, and to show that we're being good stewards of that capital and using it in a way, but also, allowing the nonprofit leaders to know how to deploy it, right? Nonprofits need to invest in grant writing capabilities to be able to raise money, need to be able to invest in marketing, right? I mean, those expenses you need to invest back into the organization to be able to grow. And so it's like, where does that money come from, right? So there needs to be...
That's right. And are we going to apologize for having overhead, for example?
Right.
So, for example, we need staff, right?
Right.
The availability of full-time, dedicated people working on our mission all the time with accountability, because they're getting paid, is going to advance the mission. Right. But on our budget, it's going to look like an overhead item, right?
Right.
So you object to paying for overhead, but overhead in this way. I mean, another easy way to think about it is we got to have light and water in our facility, right? And we got to pay our utilities. Well, that's overhead too. Right. So overhead is not a dirty word in that word. I think what people are worried about is sort of a bloated organization where people are taking lucrative salaries and at the expense of the mission. And there are probably examples of that, but it's the perception of that I think can be frustrating for nonprofits.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think that's absolutely.
What's the attitude in the business school community about this social venture kind of stuff? My perception from the outside looking in is that it has gained a lot of currency generationally, like that there may have been, I think about, like the Wall Street days of the 1980s or something, like the greed is good attitude of Gordon Gekko, where I can imagine a bunch of business schools guys sitting around. What are you doing, Raj? What are you doing taking trays of food and delivering them around town when you could be doing something that's making you personally a lot more money?
Yeah, I think you're seeing that trend, right? I think you're seeing in business schools in general I think you're seeing more schools that are offering majors and concentrations specifically around social entrepreneurship. I think you're seeing, and there may be a little bit of a pulling back, but I think as you see more ESG, right, focus within companies, I think you're seeing more of where that is becoming more important to people to say, hey, I think just generationally, especially with COVID, right? Priorities change. People don't want to just pursue money. They want to do good. They want to pursue, feel like they have mission. I think what's interesting also is that you're seeing within nonprofits more, I think, openness around other sort of earned revenue models. So as a nonprofit, you have your core mission, but that it's okay to have and it could be everything from one thing about Charlotte Rescue Mission with Community Matters Cafe, right? Where like that's a great example of a program that they've launched. I think that's sort of probably one of the best models that I've seen in Charlotte, where that's core to their mission. But I'd also, for them, I don't think it makes a whole lot of money for them or profit. But just the idea of, hey, let's really be innovative and think about, as a nonprofit, how can we serve our mission? How can we serve our constituents, but also bring lessons from the business world in terms of whether it's, selling T-shirts, selling books, whether it's opening up a cafe and earning money that way. I mean, there are a lot of ways to, again, thinking about sort of flipping the script on what a nonprofit is, right? There are a lot of different ways to do good and still make money.
Do you think that entrepreneurship is required as times change regarding funding sources and where money even comes from? It seems as though throughout our history, a lot of great good has been done by exceptionally wealthy individuals and foundations, really old, staid organizations that doled out grants on somewhat of a predictable schedule to established institutions that were well supported and doing great work for a long, long time. But that may be changing in a way that there may not be a seat at the table for scrappy young startups in that kind of an established system, and that maybe that system in itself is changing as the way people think about charity and community involvement changes.
Well, and the really interesting thing that I have learned is certainly if you're any organization, you need a diverse funding stream, right? You need to get support and funding from individual donors and corporate donors and foundations. But what I've learned, I didn't realize, is that really individual donors are the lifeblood of nonprofits, right? And so now there's even emphasis on, we want to not only have individual donors, but have recurring monthly donors, right? Much like you've seen, I feel like, in a lot of consumer companies where it's all about that recurring revenue stream, monthly subscriptions. We're seeing nonprofits really focus on how can we increase our donor base, but also retain them and get them to donate monthly, because that again creates stability for nonprofits if you're getting that recurring, and it can be $25 a month, right? We're not talking big amounts. It's, if you do the math, then it adds up. And so I think that...
So it used to be you'd send out a letter in December.
Right, right.
It's December. And I get these letters. Okay,
right.
A lot of people are still doing that, and more power to them. But you get a letter, it gets to be around Christmas time.
Right.
And you get a slew of letters from companies that are saying, hey, it's year end, you're ready to write that check. And maybe you've written $1,000 check to,
right.
and you love them. They're wonderful. But wouldn't it be interesting if you took your $1,000, right, and broke it up into like $80 a month or something
right.
like that,
right.
that in simultaneously provides the company with a predictable monthly schedule, easier to manage for business school type reasons that you know more about than I do, but also keeps me as the donor you're on my mind, right?
Right.
There's more touch points between us throughout the year and opportunities. Right. And I begin to think of myself as a supporter of yours all the time, as
Right.
opposed to just every now and then.
Right, because then that also leads to other engagement opportunities,
Right.
right? Because then it could be volunteering, it could be, and so I think that's when you look at what a nonprofit needs to be able to do from that sort of quote unquote overhead standpoint, you've got to cultivate those donors and be constantly reaching out to them and making sure that you're staying top of mind with them, but also like sharing out all the good work you're doing, right? So sending out, monthly kind of impact updates, right? Newsletters, right? It's like, how do you properly, really engage with your donors and your volunteers so that they can stay engaged with your organization? The other thing that's really interesting, because by the way, I think kind of like you touched on, any nonprofit would much rather have that money throughout the year than to wait for that check in December. It reminds me of, I recently read a book called Die with Zero. Not sure if you're familiar with that book.
I know the concept.
But one of the things that he talks about in that book is similarly that most people think, I'll just, if I'm going to have individual philanthropy, I'll just, give my money to a nonprofit after I die. And his point was, that's fine, but every nonprofit would rather have your money now, right? Sort of money now is going to help versus having money at some later date. So I think the same thing happens with, hey, if you can donate to a nonprofit a little bit throughout the year, that's going to help them with managing their cash flow, with, supporting their mission versus waiting until the end of the year.
Is there an easy way to do it? Like if I'm listening to this conversation and I'm thinking like, that's a great idea. I'd love to throw $10 a month at somebody that does each nonprofit have to manage that on their own, or are there ways in which you can sort of like do like one-stop shopping for your philanthropic initiatives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say, I think donor advised funds, I think, is what a lot of people do in terms of sort of putting money into a donor advised fund and then using that as a way to donate to nonprofits that sort of meet whatever their priorities are. But I'll say honestly, any nonprofit will make it so easy for you to donate. And now you can donate stock, you can donate crypto. I feel like there's any sort of asset you have that you can donate, and it's becoming a lot easier than it used to be. You certainly don't have to just write a check. You can it's pretty easy at this point to be able to donate.
Well, you grew up in North Carolina.
Yeah.
You went away for school and came back and came to Charlotte, and you got involved in nonprofit stuff as a result of your business school education and your desire to sort of get to know folks around town. And you now find yourself as the board chair of Feeding Charlotte. And for a deep dive on the company itself and its mission, I will point our listeners toward our interview with Kim April, who is a former executive director.
She was one of the co-founders of Feeding Charlotte, and she was the ED as well.
And so she walked us through sort of the whole model and what you do. But for you, I'm interested in the board chair role, and because you're involved in a lot of stuff. Okay, you have a full-blown job that we haven't even discussed at all, and then you have a robust array of volunteer initiatives that you're involved in. But here you are as the board chair of Feeding Charlotte, and that's a unique role. And I wonder how it's been for you and what you've learned about that gig.
Yeah, it's interesting because board service is fairly new to me. I think really when I moved to Charlotte in 2015 and through my MBA journey and through my involvement with social venture partners, really started learning more about board service, and that was something I really wanted to explore. And then here I am as a board chair of Feeding Charlotte. And so for me, it was really interesting to kind of dive deep and really understand there are a lot of differences between being on the board or leading the board of a really small nonprofit versus a larger nonprofit like United Way or something like that, right? You have the idea of a governing board versus a working board. And for a working board, Feeding Charlotte's board, we have 9 board members, right? So not a very big board, and the organization has really right now 2 full-time staff members. So you got to roll up your sleeves. And I think that much like, Feeding Charlotte is small. I think we're in year 5 right now of the organization and really growing and maturing and evolving. Boards do as well. Boards have to evolve as well. And so I think oftentimes when a nonprofit is started, the board might be filled with friends and family of the founder. It might be filled with, you might take whoever will say yes. But I think, one thing we're trying to do as the Feeding Charlotte board is really say, okay, our board needed to look a certain way to get us through the first few years of existence. But now as we want to grow, what should our board look like, right? I mean, ideally, we want to make sure that our board has the skill set and the background that we need, right? And so I think there's certain skills that any board typically would want. You want someone who has a legal background. You want someone who has a finance background. You might want some people with some sort of strategic background. For us, we also, because we are so entrenched in the food ecosystem, we want to have representation on our board from people with food backgrounds. We also, I think every nonprofit should have a board, someone on their board who comes from the groups they serve, right? And so it's very important for us to have someone representing our food recipient partners on our board as well. And we've done that. But for us, it's really taken a step back as a board and saying, what do we need to do in terms of our own board maturity, right? What policies, procedures do we need? What do we need to do from a board recruitment standpoint to make sure that we're maturing as a board as the organization matures, right? Because the needs are changing right now that we're starting to really focus on fundraising, right, as a big thing that we're looking at in terms of signing on more corporate partners and raising more money from individual donors, right? We need to think about how the board can support our executive director and our leadership and fundraising, right? So really trying to be very intentional about what we want the board to look like, how we want to grow the board. And so that's been really interesting too for me to kind of dive in and understand, try to learn more about just nonprofit governance and what role does the board serve and what responsibilities do we have as board members so that we can try to, coming from the consulting world, I've spent so much time really trying to, you always talk about best practices and really kind of seeing what certain companies do that are really good that we can then bring to other industries. And so I view it the same way with nonprofits, right? Like what best practices can we see from other nonprofits that we can bring to Feeding Charlotte to make sure that we're growing in the right way and going to continue to meet a need here in Charlotte.
Well, here you are. You're a winner of the Charlotte Ledger 40 over 40 award. Midlife for many of us, yet I will commend you on finding a lot of ways of staying young. You have a young child. You are new to board service. You are constantly looking for new things to get involved in and keep life fresh. And so I just wonder, as you like me have some gray in your beard, and so you're visibly not a spring chicken, but I wonder what your thoughts are as at this point in your life, while you're still getting involved in new things, but you've also seen some things. What you think about where you are today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always say, so as the parent of a 3-year-old, everyone always says that having kids makes you feel young. I will fully dispute that.
You disagree?
I disagree. And I have a lot more gray in my beard probably than I did 3 years ago, but that's okay, right? It's someone the other day, I was saying something about being old and they said seasoned, not old. I said, I can be seasoned.
I think you could be seasoned for a while.
Yeah.
And then eventually there ain't no denying at some point. Maybe we're not there yet.
Yeah. But to your point though, I mean, so it's been important to me to really, I sort of took the approach of kind of try a bunch of different things to find what fit for me. Like it took me a while to kind of explore, when I first got involved with nonprofits and even with sort of approaching board service, I had no idea what I even wanted to do, right? I mean, even to figure out kind of within nonprofits what my passion was and sort of how I found Feeding Charlotte just based on kind of what I learned about food waste, but also just trying to try different things and see what really resonated with me, not just some of the nonprofit work, but some of the other sort of mentoring I've done through of entrepreneurs here in Charlotte. Like for me, it's sort of finding what fit, and then really, being a parent, you really realize how valuable your time is. And so for me, I really want to be kind of just doing the most impactful things, but also, frankly, being able to model that behavior for my son, right? I once he's older, hopefully I can bring him along to different events and different, volunteer things. I want to really build that culture or expose him to that, instill that culture in him so that hopefully he will, figure all this out maybe before he turns 40 like I did.
Well, Raj Merchant, inspiring words, and thanks so much for being with me today on the Charlotte Ledger podcast.
Thanks so much, Steve, for having me.
That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This episode was produced by Lindsey Banks. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger by visiting thecharlotteledger.com.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.